Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm going to debunk some video game myths. Mostly I'm going to focus on the 1983 video game Crash. This one has a lot of fucking misinformation and false information floating around. You've heard the story, but the story you've heard is bullshit. It's literal bullshit. So here's how the story goes. In 1982, Atari was making a game console called the 2600, and in 1982 they licensed two video games. One, a home console port of the game Pac-Man, which was a popular arcade game, and the second one was E.T., the Extraterrestrial, which is based on a Steven Spielberg movie of the same name. So the story goes that Atari printed so many copies of ET, more copies of ET than they had 2600 consoles on the market, because they expected the game to be a big hit and it was going to drive sales of the console. And the official story goes, there's two versions of the story. We're going to debunk them both because they're both bullshit. Or that they're not the whole complete story. So the story goes, those two games, Pac-Man on the Atari 2600 and E.T. on the Atari 2600, were so fucking terrible. They were so awful that they crashed the video game market. So that's the first false narrative. Like, so many people returned their Ataris or whatever in massive droves. They stopped selling Ataris, and because they were discounted, allegedly, this is the story. This is how the story goes. That they were so heavily discounted that everybody else went out of business because they couldn't compete, because all the Atari games were on clearance and everybody else wasn't. And so when you went into Babbage's or Sears or wherever and you saw a $5 Atari game that was on clearance next to a $30 brand new ColecoVision game, you bought the $5 Atari game because it was on fucking clearance. And this is what caused the video game crash. And in 1985, Nintendo swooped in and saved the video game industry by releasing the NES, and everything we know today we owe to Nintendo. Blah, blah, blah. That's the story. That's the narrative. The second version of the story is mostly the same, but they add this caveat. They say the market was oversaturated in 1983. It wasn't just E.T. and just Pac-Man. That was a, quote, contributing factor. But the real culprit was oversaturation of the market. There were just too many consoles on the market. People couldn't make up their mind what to buy, so no one could get support because, whatever. People were spreading their money out between a whole bunch of options. Nobody was making any money, so everything went on clearance and the bubble burst. So those are the two official stories, except they're both bullshit. So let's debunk it piece by piece. Let's start with myth number one, that the great video game crash of 1983 wiped out all these companies and was the end of video games, and they didn't come back to life until Nintendo came to America with the NES. This is bullshit. The so-called great video game crash of 1983 wasn't a great crash at all. At all. It wasn't. You can look in the history book. You can go back and look at the sales. You can go back and look at console releases. You can look at software releases. You can look at company reports. There was no fucking 1983 video game crash. There wasn't. That's a lie. It's a myth. It never happened. There was a 1983 North American home console market crash. Now, do you see the difference? Arcades were alive and well and healthy, and new games were getting made for arcades every fucking day. Arcade companies, there was no video game crash. They never fucking stopped. They never skipped a beat. They just kept on going. Computers, Never fucking skipped a beat. They just kept on fucking going, kept on making games, kept on making money. Japan, Europe, Brazil, fucking England, Australia, they just kept on making fucking games, making consoles. There was no great worldwide video game crash that Nintendo saved the world from. It's a lie. It's a bunch of bullshit. It never fucking happened. It's a small piece of the story that has been blown up out of goddamn proportion by fucking Nintendo fanboys. So let's get that up. Let's get that fucking out there right now. Nintendo didn't save any goddamn thing. Let's just shut the fuck up with that. Second part of the myth is that the market was oversaturated. Right? There were just too much product on the market at the same time. And since there were too many choices, consumers didn't know what to buy, so nobody was buying anything in big enough sales for anybody to make money. Except that's not true. That's easy to debunk. In 1983, there were 5 game consoles on the market. There was the Atari 2600, there was the Atari 5200, there was the Mattel Intellivision, there was the ColecoVision, and there was the Magnavox Odyssey 2. That was your great console, North American console video game market. We're not talking computers. We're not talking about computer console hybrids like the XEGS or anything like that. We're not talking about that. That stuff's all separate. That stuff's separate. We're not talking about arcades. We're just talking about those 5 video game systems. So the myth is those 5 systems were on the market at the same time, and they couldn't sell enough units of any of them to make money, so the dominoes fell. Except that's easy to debunk. And you know how easy that is to debunk? Look at 1996. Just, 12 years later? In 1996, on the market, sold in stores with new games getting made, advertising dollars being spent, full-fledged support. In 1996, you had the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Genesis, the Sega CD, the CDI, the Neo Geo, the Neo Geo CD, the Sega Saturn, the Nintendo Virtual Boy, the Sega 32X, the Sony PlayStation, the Nintendo 64, the Nintendo Game Boy, the Sega Game Gear, the Sega Nomad, the Sega CDX, the JVC XI, the Atari Jaguar, and the Atari Jaguar CD, all on the market in 1996. But we didn't have a video game crash in 1996. The market in 1996 was over fucking saturated. And we didn't have a video game crash. So how could the market be oversaturated in 1983 when there were only 5 game consoles? When the market wasn't oversaturated 10 years later when there were 3 times that many. Okay. So the next half of that myth we can debunk is Pac-Man was so bad and E.T. was so bad that nobody bought them. And they were heavily discounted. They were put on clearance, and the dominoes fell. Those 2 games were so bad that it almost put that company out of business, Atari out of business. This is a half-truth. Yes, it is true that Atari printed more ET cartridges than there were Atari 2600 consoles on the market. And the game came out Christmas 1982, which means it would have been on sale primarily in 1983, the alleged year of the so-called crash. Right? This almost tracks. Except for a couple of points that people fudge. The video, so that's 1 game. That's 2 games. It's 2 games. But Pac-Man didn't come out in 1982. Pac-Man came out in 1981. Pac-Man had already come out in 1981 and had already flopped and been discontinued and was no longer being sold by the time 1983 came along. So there were no Pac-Man cartridges in your Sears that were heavily discounted to compete with your full price ColecoVision games. Do you see where I'm going with that? The game had already been discontinued. Going a step further, you can look at Atari's release schedule. You can go back and look at their release schedule. You can look at their financial reports. You can look at their sales numbers. Atari's other cartridges, Pitfall, Space Invaders, Millipede, Galaga, Haunted House, Combat, etc., etc. These were still selling really well. And they were still getting new games. Atari 2600 was still getting brand new, full-priced retail games in 1982. If this so-called alleged video game crash had actually happened, Atari would have stopped making Atari 2600 games in 1983 when the crash happened, and then they wouldn't have started making games again until after Nintendo came out and saved the video game industry and made it viable again, right? That's the narrative. Except that's not what happened. Atari was still making brand new, full-priced, full retail games in 1983. And they were still selling profitable numbers in 1983. And they were still selling and making new games, etc. in 1984. And in 1985. And in 1986, after the NES came out. 1987, they were still making brand new full-priced Atari 2600 cartridges. 1989, 1990. They didn't discontinue support for the Atari 2600 until the early 90s. And they did so because year after year, sales declined, and they were getting ready to release their new hardware, the Atari Jaguar, So they didn't have any reason to keep selling Atari 2600 cartridges and systems because they were putting out a new product to take its place. Okay, so we've already thoroughly debunked that piece of the so-called crash. If there had been a crash, Atari would have stopped making games at some point and then had to start making games again at another point after Nintendo came out. That never happened. Atari never stopped making games. There was no period where Atari cartridges in 1983 were on clearance and bargain bins in Sears sitting next to everybody else full price games. No, Atari's games were sitting there on the shelf full price next to ColecoVision and Intellivision games. So that's not it, right? That's bullshit. So then the other thing people talk about is, well, it wasn't just the oversaturation, and it wasn't just because there was no oversaturation. We've already debunked that, so fuck off. And it wasn't just the heavily discounted software because of the ET fiasco, but it was also software just sucked at the time. Like, everybody's games just sucked because they weren't Mario. They just weren't good games, right? That's the other narrative, the other, proposed explanation for the so-called video game crash. Except that it's also not 100% true. You see, they, like I've already said, Atari was still making new 2600 cartridges throughout that whole time span. They never stopped. There was no dip. Actually, their sales grew through that period. They were growing during the so-called crash. So, I don't know. You explain it to me. And then you had all the games sucked, right? Everybody's like, all the games sucked. There weren't any good games. Well, this is thoroughly debunked by one, sales records, if you go back and look at the software that was being sold, and two, if you look at reviews of games that were being sold at the time. Demon Attack is an example. Atlantis is an example. I've already mentioned Pitfall as an example. There were other games. Games like Zaxxon was a popular one. Frogger was a popular one. There were still good quality, fun, highly reviewed, highly regarded, good AAA games being released during that time period at full retail price. So that's not it. Now let's jump back to 1996. Let's talk about quality of software, right? They're talking about the video game crash happened because of quality software, which I just fucking debunked. But let's look at 1996. Let's look at these systems. Super NES. They had some good games in 1996, but Nintendo never had any problems selling Super NES, right? That system sold well until they discontinued it. Sega Genesis. They had some good games in 1996. Good quality games in 1996. So, they were selling. Sega CD? No. Sega CD was not known for its software. That is where you're going to find the rubbish. CDI. CDI is not known for its software library. Again, that's where you're going to find the rubbish. Neo Geo. Neo Geo had its own set of problems. Neo Geo CD had its own set of problems, so we're gonna brush that aside. Sega Saturn. Sega Saturn had some quality titles, but they had a lot of subpar titles too. This is well documented. Sega Saturn had other problems, but it is well documented. The Sega Saturn had a lot of subpar titles. 3DO, mostly rubbish. Like 2, maybe 3 standout titles and the rest garbage. Virtual Boy, the whole goddamn thing was only on the market for like 6 months, so fucking rubbish. 32X. 32X would be discontinued by the end of 1996, so obviously it sucked. PlayStation, we all know, was a gold mine. N64 come out at the end of 1996, but it still had good games in 1996. Game Boy was still selling well. Game Gear was still limping along. Nomad had just come out, but it was a Genesis, so it played Genesis games. CDX played Genesis games and Sega CD games. XI played Genesis and Sega CD games. LaserVision may have been on its way out in 1996, and Atari Jaguar CD were discontinued by the end of 1996. LaserVision was rubbish, Jaguar was rubbish, Jag CD was rubbish. So you had an oversaturated market in 1996 of rubbish games. But the market didn't crash in 1996. Can you explain that? Yeah, I can, and I'll get there. So, what about going back to 1983? Let's go back to 1983 again. What about the claim? Well, all the games were fucking identical. You had Pac-Man on the Atari systems, and then you had Casey Munchkin on the Odyssey 2, and then you had whatever the quote Pac-Man clone was on the ColecoVision and the Intellivision, etc. And allegedly, this great mythological crash happened because consumers couldn't tell one game from another. Allegedly, this is the allegation. Allegedly, they couldn't tell one game from another. Except, again, if you go back and look at sales reports, if you go back and look at release schedules, you go back and look at magazine reviews, consumers very much could tell the difference between Galaga on the Atari 2600 and Demon Attack on the Atari 2600. They were two different games. Yeah, Demon Attack is essentially a Galaga clone, more or less, but it's different enough that consumers can look at it and say, yeah. Just like, going back to the 90s again, Street Fighter 2 specifically, and King of Fighters are basically the same game, essentially. But you can tell, consumers can tell enough of a difference between those two games to be able to pick one over the other. You can look at, you're not going to look at Street Fighter 2 and say, is that King, you're not going to mistake it for King of Fighters. You're going to know that's Street Fighter 2. You're not going to look at King of Fighters and mistake that for Samurai Showdown. You're going to know which is which. Same thing in 1983. You would know Demon Attack from Space Invaders, from Defender, from Galaga. They were that different. They had some surface level, superficial similarities. But that's it. Just like fucking Mortal Kombat and Primal Rage have superficial similarities. But they're not the same goddamn game, and people can tell the difference. And again, you can go back and look at magazine reviews, and you can look at sales numbers. So, how then do we explain this alleged, imaginary, make-believe, mythological video game crash that never happened? Where does it come from? Why do people think there was this great video game crash in 1983 when there wasn't? Why do they falsely remember it as such? Because they've been told this. They've been told this by Nintendo and Nintendo reps and by Nintendo fans. Nintendo saved the video game industry. And this has been repeated so many times people believe it. But why? Well, there were what we call some coincidental side effects of some poor business decisions that culminated in 1983. And when you look at, they all happened in the same year, it looks like there was some big market crash because Magnavox discontinued the Odyssey and said, we can't sell it no more. We're done. And Atari decided that they couldn't sell the 5200 anymore, so they discontinued it. They said, we're done. Mattel in television said, we can't sell it anymore. They discontinued it. We're done. Coleco said, we're done with the ColecoVision. We're going to discontinue it. We're done. And retailers aren't going to buy video games anymore. But that's not true. You can go back and look at the sales numbers and see that, yes, the Odyssey had been discontinued by 1983 and was no longer for sale and no longer getting support. But they didn't discontinue the Intellivision until 1991. They didn't discontinue the Atari 2600 until 1993, I think, or 92. Now, they did discontinue the ColecoVision in 1983 because they replaced it with the Atom that didn't take off. So they discontinued it because they replaced it with what they thought was a superior product, except the superior product didn't take. That wasn't some imaginary crash. That was just a business decision. A business decided this product is no longer serving our interests. We're going to discontinue it and replace it with this product that we hope will serve our interests. Just because nobody bought the Atom doesn't mean there was this great imaginary mythological fucking crash that never happened. It just means that nobody bought the Atom. The same year nobody was buying Odyssey anymore. The same year that Atari decided they couldn't sell the 5200 anymore. Well, let's look at the 5200. Why did Atari discontinue the 5200? Did they discontinue the 5200 because of this video game crash that never happened? Or was there another plausible explanation? The 5200 was released in 1982, a year before the alleged crash that never happened. Here's what did happen. The 5200 launched in 1982 with no software. And it was expensive. And the 2600 was popular. The software on the 2600 was popular. People wanted to play those games. They didn't want to play the games that were on the 5200 because it was the same games, just better graphics. That wasn't a big sell. The 5200 was expensive. Also, Coleco had a machine on the market called the Gemini that was fully compatible with Atari 2600 cartridges. So you could buy a machine made by Coleco in 1982, 1983 that could play Atari 2600 games. You could buy an adapter for the ColecoVision that would let you play Atari 2600 games on your ColecoVision. You could buy an adapter that let you play Atari 2600 games on your Intellivision. So the consumer, the market, had assumed you could play Atari 2600 cartridges on the 5200. When the market found out that wasn't the case, they rejected the machine because they said, we're just going to stick to the machine we have. So what did Atari do? They discontinued the machine because it was too expensive and it wasn't selling. If they had kept selling it, they would have lost money. They didn't discontinue it because of some imaginary crash that never happened. They discontinued it because of poor business decisions. What about the Atari 7800? This is where we get a little fishy. So the 7800 was designed in 1983 and Atari shelved it. And then in 1985, they decided to revisit it and release it anyways. The story goes, the crash happened in 83, and so Atari couldn't sell the 7800, so they chose not to. They literally just chose not to. And because they chose not to, no, let's back it up. Because of the crash, they couldn't sell it because game stores wouldn't buy it. Retailers wouldn't buy it. So they had no choice but to wait for Nintendo, their savior, to come in and make video games cool again, allegedly, so that retailers would stock the 7800. That's the story. Except that's not true either. And I'm going to get to that in a second. Here's what really happened. Atari created the Atari had 3 divisions. Okay, people forget this. Atari had 3 divisions. And they were owned by Warner Brothers at the time, by the way. So let's put that up there. Atari had home consoles, they had home computers, and they had arcade machines. The arcade division never skipped a beat, never stopped making money. They kept on making machines throughout the whole alleged crash. The computer division did good throughout the 80s. They didn't start struggling until the early 90s. And the home console division as a whole wasn't struggling in the 80s. The 5200 as a product was struggling in 1983. But let's expound on this a little bit. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Okay, let's get into the meat and potatoes here. The Atari 5200 is essentially a stripped down Atari ST computer. So Atari had this not supercomputer, but this gaming computer called the ST, which stood for 16-bit, 32-bit. It was running on a 16-bit, 32-bit processor. It was called the ST. And it had an operating system called TOS, the operating system. It was a GUI-based operating system. This was to compete with the Apple equivalent would have been the Lisa and the Macintosh. Okay, and then later Commodore's Amiga. Okay, so the 5200 took the keyboard out, took the monitor output out, put in a controller port, put in a cartridge port instead of a floppy drive, and shipped it to Sears and said, here you go. But nobody bought it. So what happened to the 7800? This is where we have conflicting stories from official reports. So we're just going to go with the narrative versus what we can piece together ourselves. We know the narrative is false. We know that because retailers didn't stop selling Retailers never got to a point where they said, we're not going to sell video games anymore because video games are a liability, because they never stopped selling video games. They were still selling Apple video games. They were still selling Commodore video games. They were still selling Atari video games. They were still selling video games when the NES launched. So we're going to talk about Nintendo and their deceptive practices here in a minute. We're going to get there. Because Nintendo, they're very fucking shady. We're going to get there. But here's what really happened. What really happened was Atari was making a machine, the 7800, that was going to be an 8-bit processor with a graphics chip comparable to the Famicom in Japan, right? This was basically what they were developing in their version of the NES. Nintendo and Atari had a back closed door deal where Atari was going to bring the Famicom to the US market under their banner and sell it in the US. This did happen. This is real. This is documented. This is fact. This isn't the myth. This is what really happened. There was a miscommunication and a disagreement with Coleco over the rights of Donkey Kong and Atari. Atari had console rights to Donkey Kong, and Coleco had computer rights to Donkey Kong, and Donkey Kong was on the Atom. Coleco asserted the Atom was a computer. Atari asserted the Atom was a console. Nintendo didn't give a shit. They just wanted to get their fucking system. They wanted to seal the deal, make the sale. And Atari backed out. Atari said, fuck off, we're not going to deal with you. We're not going to deal with Nintendo. So it wasn't so much there was a video game crash that happened that Nintendo came in and had to convince the market to let them sell their machine because nobody was buying video games anymore, because that's not what happened. That's not true. That never happened. That never fucking happened. All the so-called news reports of that happening, all the stories of that happening are retellings people told starting in the 90s about what they remembered happening, but it never fucking... There are no contemporary news reports of a video game crash happening in 1983. There was no video game crash in 1983. CNN didn't report on it. NBC didn't report on it. ABC didn't report on it because it didn't fucking happen. It didn't fucking happen. What did happen was a series of events that when you look back on it with the lens of hindsight, yeah, it almost looks like there was this great big crash and Nintendo swooped in and saved the market. But you can debunk this all day long. Atari did crash. The market did crash. There was a crash. I'm not saying there was never a crash in 1983. It just wasn't this worldwide global phenomenon. It was an isolated series of incidents that happened in 1983 that only affected a handful of companies that were making home consoles. But they didn't just stop selling home consoles cold turkey, and retailers didn't say, we're not selling video games anymore. We're just not selling video games anymore. That never fucking happened. That part of the story never happened. What happened was Atari did print too many copies of E.T., and they got their asses chewed on that, and the bottom dropped out. Their stock dropped. So Warner sold it. They sold off Atari. Went to two different places. Jack Tramiel, who had founded Commodore Computers, bought a chunk of it, and he kept going forward. And then eventually a chunk of it got bought up by Midway and other companies. It got bounced around, we'll say. Eventually it ended up in the hands of Infogrames, but it went through Hasbro and Midway and a few other sellers at the time, but it changed hands. But they never stopped selling product. What happened with the 7800 was they had the system ready to go, but when Warner Brothers sold off Atari, Jack Tramiel and Commodore, which was his other company, they already had the Commodore 64 on the market. They already had the Amiga on the market. They looked at the market and said, well, we've got Commodore, We've got Amiga. You've got Atari over here, 2600 over here. It's doing well. We don't need the 7800. There's no room in the market for the 7800. It wasn't because of the crash. It was literally just because they already had something on the market instead of that was doing well that they didn't need to replace it. They didn't need to replace the 2600 because the 2600 was fine, alive and well. People were still buying it. Companies were still making games for it. It was doing good. They didn't sell off the Atari 2600 because it wasn't selling. They sold off the Atari 2600 because they lost their asses on ET. And because the stock market doesn't give a fuck about reality, they are emotional. They tanked. They tanked the stock because they're like, oh my god, this is a crash. So there was a stock crash, a video game stock crash. But that's a whole nother video for a whole nother day. Companies recovered quickly, so it wasn't this worldwide crash either, and it wasn't this long-term crash that kept video games out of retailers. So what happened with the Nintendo? Why did Nintendo have to go to retailers and make that buyback promise? So here's the story. The story is retailers wouldn't make video games anymore. So Nintendo had to intentionally design the Nintendo Entertainment System to be a toy. The Famicom renamed it the Nintendo Entertainment System to be a toy, and they had to agree to buy back unsold inventory just to get it in stores. So the story is the reason for that was because of the crash. Except, again, that's not true. That's not true, and we know this because Tonka imported the Sega Master System, the SG 1000 Mark III, from Japan to the US the same year. The same goddamn year. Tonka didn't have to redesign the Master System to look like a toy in order to sell it in Sears. Tonka didn't have to make a buyback guarantee in order to sell it in stores. Tonka didn't have to lie to retailers and say, it's not a video game, it's an entertainment system to get it sold. No, Sears bought Sega Master Systems knowing goddamn good and well it was a video game console. Why did Tonka get Sega in Sears and Macy's and everywhere else, and Nintendo had to come up with this charade? Because Nintendo was an unknown company. That's it. That is it. Nintendo, literally, they've existed since the 1980s, but in North America, in the United States, this is before the internet, before we were international, in the 1980s, Nintendo didn't exist in North America. Nobody knew who they were. They had no presence. They had no history. They literally didn't even exist. They had a handful of arcade games. Donkey Kong, Popeye, Mario Brothers, Donkey Kong Jr., like 2 or 3 others. That's it. That's all they had. Some arcade games. Everybody knew arcades were successful. Everybody knew Donkey Kong the arcade was a success. But nobody knew Donkey Kong the home cartridge was going to be a success. Nobody knew. You know why? Because Donkey Kong had already been ported to the ColecoVision. It had already been ported to the Intellivision. It had already been ported to the Atari 2600 and everything else. It was already on the market. People already bought it and moved on and forgot about it. It was already past tense. No, in 1985, nobody was going to run out and buy this brand new shiny Nintendo Entertainment System just to play Donkey Kong. They had already played it, beat it, got the high score, sold it at a yard sale, and gotten over it. It was past tense. Donkey Kong was the big thing in 1983 that sold the Famicom in Japan. Nintendo couldn't go to Sears or Macy's or whoever and say, we've got this machine called the NES and it plays Donkey Kong. and expected to get sold in stores. Stores were going to look at it and go, nobody's playing Donkey Kong anymore. It's an old game. That's old news. Nobody cares. Now here's Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Brothers was launched on the NES. There was no Famicom version to port or export. There was no arcade version to port. It was launched on day one, the day the NES came out. Which means Nintendo had to show Super Mario Brothers to Sears, to Macy's, and say, this is the game people are going to buy the system to play. They're going to buy an NES to play Super Mario Brothers. Now, when you look at the market at the time, space shooters, maze games, action games, racing games, robot games, you look at the games that were actually selling at the time, and you compare those to Super Mario Brothers. Yes, we know Super Mario Brothers is revolutionary and groundbreaking, but when you look at it from a business perspective, it's new, it's different, it's untested, it's unproven, it doesn't match what the market is doing. It wasn't a guaranteed hit. It wasn't a guaranteed hit. So Nintendo had no choice but to make the buyback offer to get into stores, because nobody heard of them. Nobody knew what Super Mario Brothers was. They didn't understand it. Gamers, when it came out, did understand it. It was a great fucking game. We're not gonna discredit the game or the sales of the NES. We're not gonna do that. We're not gonna say Nintendo sucked, and we're not gonna take away the parts of history they do deserve credit for. We're just gonna stop fucking giving them credit for stuff that they don't deserve credit for. They didn't save the goddamn video game industry. So let's stop saying they did, because they didn't. The video game industry was alive and well and didn't need them to save it. It was alive and fucking well anyways. Also, remember that Atari 2600 I told you about? Or the 7800, excuse me? It did get released in 1985 when the NES was coming out, because Atari realized Sega, through Tonka has this machine that's going to be in stores. That's competition. That's a new machine. It can play games our machine can't. We have this machine over here that can compete with that. Let's get this thing on the market and compete with that. Atari was not responding to Nintendo. Atari was responding to established Tonka. They weren't responding to Nintendo. Nintendo didn't exist. They didn't even know who they didn't know who Nintendo was. They're like, what the fuck's a Nintendo? They were responding to Tonka. Tonka was a big deal. Tonka had household name recognition. To this day, you know who Tonka is. Everybody knows who Tonka is. Now you're sitting here saying, why am I saying Tonka when it was the Sega Master System? Because in the US, Tonka distributed the Master System, not Sega. Sega manufactured it in Japan, sold it to Tonka, and Tonka sold it to retailers. So, to Sears, it wasn't the Sega Master System, it was the Tonka Master System. It was a Tonka product. Do you see where I'm going with this? Atari was competing with Tonka. Retailers were responding to Tonka, an established company with a new product. And Nintendo, an unknown company with an unknown product, had to make concessions to get into retailers. Once they sold, and everybody saw how great they were, and then Tonka couldn't sell the Master System anymore, and Atari couldn't sell the 7800 anymore, then things changed. Then the market went to Nintendo, and the rest is history. Okay, yeah, fair enough. Except for we're not going to talk about their monopolistic practices. That's another video for another day. This is getting long already. So here's what really happened. What really happened is Atari had a bad day in 1983 because of some bad business decisions and got sold off. Magnavox couldn't sell the Odyssey 2 anymore because it was outdated. No one wanted to play it anymore. It was fucking outdated. No one was buying the 5200 because it was expensive and didn't have any goddamn games. Coleco was still being sold throughout this time, and television was being sold throughout this time. 2600 was still being sold throughout this time. Commodore, Amiga, Apple, IBM PC, everything else, etc., etc., etc. There was no fucking video game crash. It's a lie. It's a goddamn lie. There was a sequence of events that, in hindsight, almost look like a great video game crash if you squint hard enough. If you squint hard enough. Yes, there was a stock crash of tech companies in 1983. And there was big sellouts and shakeups and everything else. But it wasn't this massive worldwide collapse of the video game market that Nintendo had to save. It was a couple of isolated incidents that got blown up out of proportion over the years.